I went searching for an alligator in the sewer. What I found was much worse. "Sure this is it?" I asked hesitantly, with preconceived notions on my mind at the time. "Positive this is where it happened. I'll show you where I found him," he replied. "Right before us it stood, the entrance, at least 10 feet in diameter, looming above, to the underground sanitation system beneath the city. Without haste, we entered, braving whatever we'd encounter in the dark ahead." Here I was, a scientist grounded by reality and empirical evidence, chasing what was otherwise a fanciful legend with a tunnel worker in the sewers. Honestly, the last thing anybody would expect someone in my line of work to be doing. Urban myths about the underground, the dark, enclosed space beneath cities, have existed for as long as anyone can remember, and the best example of these kinds of accounts takes place in sanitation systems. New York, Chicago, just about every metropolis in the country has come up with each of their own localized legends that take place in the dark tunnels and drainages beneath, describing such entities as humanoid reptilians, mole people, giant rats, and so on. If you were to ask me several months ago, my immediate answer to all this was, of course, horseshit, nothing more. Hardly anything can live in a sewer save for your usual household pests. The environment offered here is rich in Salmonella, Shigella, and E. coli, microorganisms that one usually finds in waste, rendering it uninhabitable for just about anything bigger than a rat. This was convincing enough for me that, quite strongly, none of these accounts would ever turn out to have elements of truth to them. That all changed about 3 months ago. Reports told of a sanitation worker who had been mortally injured in the city's sewage systems. After being found and saved by another employee, he was immediately rushed to the emergency room. When interviewed, he stated that while doing a patrol in the tunnels, he was attacked by what he claims to have been an alligator. Upon hearing this, I quickly dismissed his claim. The idea of alligators lurking in sewers comes from claims dating back to the 1930s. Tourists from places like New York would be visiting Florida, and souvenir shops selling live gator hatchlings, their small demeanor making them desirable to keep as pets, but when growing too large they would be flushed down the toilet and into the sewer. In the tunnels and underground passages they would grow to massive sizes and lose both eyesight and pigmentation, turning them albino. All this according to the legend, that is. Of course, when you look at it through a scientific lens, it doesn't hold up. With the low subterranean temperatures and high levels of bacteria from fecal matter, it's virtually impossible for a population of large reptiles to have established in a sewer system, let alone survive. And while individual gators have been found in storm drains, none of them could have possibly survived in the long term. Neither were any albino as described in the old accounts. At the end of the day, it's all merely legend. At least that's how I confidently felt. The most likely explanation I could think of was that this man became delusional from noxious gases and injured himself in the process. The next part of the story, however, took me by surprise. Apparently, surgeons had removed what looked like a tooth from the worker's thigh. My first thought was that the only explanation for such a phenomenon was that somebody had indeed released an unwanted pet that had somehow entered a storm drain. The animal in question was probably deceased or close to it at that point. However, when I was able to properly ID and analyze the tooth, things, well, made even less sense. You see, alligator teeth are long, conical and cylinder-like. Now, I hadn't the slightest idea what reptile this belonged to, but this was not something that came from an alligator's jaw. The tooth I had was knife-shaped and jagged at the edges, a feature the teeth of no known crocodilian species possessed. It was frustrating. An occurrence which should have been easy to explain just became gradually more and more difficult to comprehend. No matter how long I looked at this damn tooth, I couldn't get to the bottom of it. The next day I was in the fossil halls, relaxing by the dinosaurs and other prehistoric life displays, still baffled by the tooth. As I did, though, I noticed something. I was standing beneath the skeleton of the South American theropod Carnotaurus when my attention suddenly turned to its jaws. It looked familiar. No, There's no way, was what I was thinking. Instinctively, I rushed over to the lab. I immediately took out the tooth and headed back over to the displays. To my astonishment, it wasn't identical, but it was quite damn close to what was in the dinosaur's jaws. I stood there for a good 5 minutes trying to make sense of this seemingly coincidental resemblance I had just come across. There just had to be a logical explanation. I figured the only way to get to the bottom of this was to travel to the source itself. So I contacted the hospital where the worker was being kept. When asked if I could interview the man, I was unfortunately turned down at first, but after being persistent, both staff and patient agreed reluctantly. The first thing I asked was for him to recall his experience down in the tunnels. His story raised even more questions as he described the alleged alligator standing on its hind legs, and that its forelimbs were hardly more than little stubs. It was quick, dark in coloration and incredibly aggressive. After getting the account firsthand, I had asked where he encountered the creature. Instead of giving me an answer, though, he took out a pen and sheet of paper and wrote down a phone number, telling me to call that number for more information. I called shortly after, which brought me to the other sanitation worker that was present during the incident. I'd told him that his hospitalized co-worker referred me and that I desperately needed to get to the bottom of this. Tim, the employee I spoke with, was at first hesitant but ultimately agreed, stating I would need somebody who knew the tunnels from the inside out to navigate. This brought me to where I currently was, walking through the sanitation system beneath the city. Our gear consisted of headlamps and night vision goggles for the dark corridors, as well as respirators in case of ammonia or hydrogen sulfide. As expected, the smell was rank and awful. What else was I to expect? I was in the sewers. The dark, foreboding tunnels seemed to go on for miles. As we traversed the subterranean labyrinth, I couldn't stop thinking about the recovered tooth. No matter what my mind tried doing to rationalize it, I just couldn't put my finger on this predicament. This tooth was allegedly from an escaped alligator, but it somehow bears a near uncanny resemblance to the teeth of the skeleton in the museum. As I pondered, I followed Tim closely, heeding his advice in regard to where it was safe to step and whatever substances to avoid touching at any costs, which was quite obvious given where we were. For hours we walked, nothing but the beams of our helmet lamps illuminating the path in front of us. Eventually, Tim stopped for a good minute before rushing around the corner to find a rather unexpected scene. It was a series of pipes, only busted and completely destroyed, with steam leaking out of several of the openings. Could this have been some sort of accident brought about by built-up pressure and faulty tubes? Tim, the hell, the thing was just fine yesterday. Tim's comments suggested that a sudden accident seemed unlikely. I trusted his judgment given how well he knew the tunnels and passages beneath the city. Upon closer inspection, something caught my eye. The edges of the tubes looked damaged in a specific way. This was no accident. Something had bitten through these pipes, yet something about it felt blatantly off. The first and most obvious thing that I realized was that they were too high above the floor for a gator to reach. I mean, the animal could have crawled up and bitten them, but in this scenario, it doesn't seem feasible. More importantly, there were massive, rigid gashes embedded deep within the busted metal. Alligators attack with a quick grab and pull, usually accompanied by a death roll. The marks their teeth leave show deep punctures embedded in the wound. However, this was different. These pipes were violently torn apart, with lacerations that turned to deep gashes halfway down. Whatever was lurking down here would need to have had a frighteningly powerful set of jaws to accomplish such a feat. "My boss ain't gonna be happy about this," Tim apprehensively remarked. We didn't stick around for much longer, continuing down the tunnels and on the trail of whatever had left this carnage. As we went deeper, the tunnels were increasingly restricted in space. The air became stale, signaling us to use our respirators for safety. At one point, I decided to ask Tim about his account that day, when he came across his fellow employee, to which he said, "Tim, found him during my shift, all bloody and bruised." Only thing I could make out him saying was "gator," at least along the lines of that. Thing that stuck out the most, though, was his leg. Something clearly took a bite out of it. As he recalled his ordeal, he seemed somewhat on edge. As soon as I could, I radioed for 911, and when I did, I heard this sound like some deep moan echoing around the corner. Before he could say anything else, he suddenly flinched. Out of nowhere, a rat ran out of the darkness beneath Tim and I. It didn't pay us any heed, simply bolting through. Tim shot back a little, a look of held-back disgust on his face. Immediately, another one bolted past us, with a second rat trailing behind. Gradually, more and more rats were running in the opposite direction out of the darkness, all of them bolting past us at full speed, not seeming to care about our presence. Tim muttered, "Just vile." Tim looked as if he were going to throw up. They were all just running, in the same direction, as if something had terrified them. There was no doubt the two of us were getting close to it, whatever it was. Then it went quiet for a solid minute. No rats, not even hissing from the surrounding pipes, just eerie silence. It was then broken by the sound of faint splashing off in the distance. Tim and I flashed our beams in the direction of the noise, but were only met with what seemed like impenetrable darkness. Another splash, this one slightly closer, the sudden noise of which put the two of us ever more on edge. I quickly switched on my night vision goggles and scanned my surroundings, but there was nothing, just endless dark. I turned to face Tim and my heart stopped. Above him was a tall, menacing shape. I couldn't make out any details, just a pair of seemingly glowing eyes hovering above him. Tim looked at me with concern, but before he could say anything, I quickly whispered to him, "Stand." "Absolutely." "Still," Tim started to say. "What in the hell are you?" But in half a second, the dark figure dove and grabbed Tim, dragging him off into the darkness, his screams echoing throughout the tunnels. In that moment, I was in utter, fear-induced paralysis. Whatever this thing was, it was certainly not a damn gator. Immediately, I bolted after him, following the echoes down the passages. This thing, though, it was crazy fast. As, in a matter of minutes, I lost track of it, and Tim. Within seconds, my surroundings fell back into silence. The splashing, the screaming, all of a sudden stopped. I had no idea what to do, so I had to act immediately. Without haste, I continued in the direction I heard the creature going. As I did, I ran into another familiar sight, more damaged pipes. Only these weren't bitten, but more crushed and scraped. There were white scratch marks on the tubes that had been otherwise flattened against the wall. But there was more. Down below there were several reflective jet-black objects. I knelt down to get a better look, and when I picked them up, they felt jagged yet smooth. I was clearly holding reptilian scales, likely shed when the animal rammed into the pipes. A struggle, maybe. Then I heard it, a deep bellowing hiss echoing through the tunnels. But where was Tim? I had to find him, but I sure as hell didn't want to end up on the business end of this thing's jaws. Reluctantly, I proceeded in the direction of the noise. As I did, the corridors widened, giving me more space to move, which was reassuring, but also meant that it could come at me from any direction unexpectedly. I made sure not to let my guard down, listening to every sound, every hiss, water droplet, constantly looking in every direction, ready to expect an ambush. Each of my footsteps was slowly but vigilantly taken. I carefully treaded my way down, when suddenly I heard a loud crack beneath my foot. I shined my headlamp's beam to the ground, almost immediately jumping back. It was part of a human skull with assorted bones adjacent to it. The bones were broken into pieces, sporting massive bite marks and lacerations. This thing had eaten someone, and it looks like Tim was its next meal. I quickly switched on my night vision goggles, and up ahead lied a trail of blood. Blood, I was confident and terrified of whom it was from. As quickly as I could, I ran down the trail, the swathes of blood seemingly becoming thicker as I did. My heartbeat gradually increasing. Soon an absolutely rotten stench filled my nostrils, bringing me ever more close to the scene of the crime. Soon I got to a bend in the passage, stumbling upon a utility vault, and I was soon to find out that my worst fear had been realized. There, in the center of the vault, was the lifeless body of Tim. There was no mistaking it. As I walked over to investigate, he was very much dead. Lying in a pool of blood, half-eaten, I nearly threw up, but what stood out was something yellowish pale embedded in his now exposed ribcage. Without thinking, I pulled it out, and it was another tooth, exactly like the one from the museum. I decided that, whatever this thing was, it wasn't worth dying to find out. I needed to get my ass out of here. Luckily, utility vaults connect to manholes, and there was one right above this gory mess. My next and only priority in that moment was to climb out and alert the authorities regarding my deceased guide. Then, like a rushing typhoon, I felt a gust of stale, rank air rush past me, followed by a deep, growling hiss, the impact of which froze my entire body solid except for my heart, now operating at full force. Without warning, I felt something rough ram up against my back, knocking me down into the water. Looking up, my headlamp's beam finally revealed a good look at the creature. There it was, the outline of a large reptilian predator, 10 meters in length, stiff tail, massive jaws covered in thick reinforced scales. There was no mistaking what this thing was, only it wasn't the same animal as the skeleton display at the museum, lacking the signature bull horns of a Carnotaurus. No, this thing instead had a jagged spiked comb atop its head. It then opened its mouth to reveal a menacing row of teeth covered in the entrails of its last meal, that being Tim, then proceeded to let out a blood-curdling roar. It began to close in on me, its jaws drawing closer. This wasn't hunting behavior. The animal was clearly exhibiting territoriality toward me. My survival instincts kicked in and I rushed to my feet, bolting toward the ladder. In this moment, escaping through the manhole was the only thing on my mind. Unfortunately, I only made it a few steps before I slipped and fell once more. The animal continued its advance on me, aggressively gnashing its jaws, backing me against a wall. What happened next was unexpected. A sudden white flash appeared, the appearance of which caught the attention of the creature, who looked at it for a solid minute, seemingly forgetting I was even here. It was some sort of pulsating vortex. At its center, I swore I could almost make out some sort of landscape. It then proceeded to flash brighter, which apparently signaled the animal to run toward it, bolting into the vortex of white light and disappearing. The pulsating picked up in speed, flickering faster with each second until it contracted and disappeared. I was sitting here in near total darkness once more, the only light coming from the beam of my headlamp. The mangled body of Tim lay there in the center of the room, the stench still rank. Immediately I headed to the ladder and crawled out through the manhole, lifting the lid to find myself on a sidewalk. Without hesitation, I contacted the authorities. The paramedics had arrived within the hour, and once having retrieved Tim, sealed him away in a body bag. I luckily only had minor cuts and bruises. Roughly a week later, the autopsy report suggested Tim's death was the result of some animal mauling, with the tooth I pulled from his corpse confiscated by the police department as evidence of the incident. Ultimately, the report stated that Tim's demise was attributed to an escaped alligator, as eyewitness reports had claimed, although no such creature was ever found. I, however, know better. I had been able to hold on to the scales I had recovered, keeping them in my office at the museum as a reminder of the whole ordeal. There's not a single doubt in my mind that what I saw was a dinosaur, only it wasn't any genus known to science, and that vortex, I swore I saw something on the other side. Was it a portal of some sorts? If so, to where or when? My first theory was that this was some portal that led to the past. But then another thought crossed my mind. Could that have been an alternate timeline? It would explain the animal's unfamiliarity. At the end of the day, however, I found no answers, just more and more questions. Despite my encounter, I wanted to get to the bottom of it all. I needed to find out the truth for myself, so I've decided that despite the risk, I need to go back down there. I needed answers, and I was determined to find them at any cost.